Welcome to Decrypting the Law, your source for legal insights about the tokenized future. I'm Jason Salmonsato, Senior Counsel on the 0x Core team. Today we have a special episode for you. The 0x Core team hosted our first ever full-day conference on February 7th called Zero Expo. And during that conference, I had the opportunity to sit down and interview Rainey Reitman, who is the Chief Programs Officer for the EFF. There's plenty of context in the interview itself, so I don't want to give too much introduction, but before we jump in, I wanted to make one clarification. During the video, we talk a little bit about the 1990s and a time when the EFF was defending folks who were developing private encryption software. And during that discussion, Rainey reached out to me and asked if I could clarify that one of the points she was trying to make is that a developer could, for example, write down the encryption code in a book, and that would be perfectly legal. But to publish that same code online would be considered a violation of the law, a very obvious kind of inconsistent standard there. But as you will hear from the video, that's a small clarification on what she said during the video. So I hope you enjoy. Stick around after the video to hear a little bit about what I'm thinking to do in the next video and how you can have a role.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I'm really excited about this. I think this will be a little bit of a shift probably from what we've already discussed today, and also just more traditionally, if you come to these conferences, you're probably used to the typical lawyer segment that's talking about regulation and securities laws, and that's definitely my background. But one of the interesting things that I wanted to do was to kind of bring on a different voice. I think when we talk about this industry a lot, I know at 0x we have like very long-term goals, and if you remember early on, Will was talking about kind of democratizing access to financial products and to value transactions. And I think probably what we don't realize is doing that can be very disruptive, and not just as a company thing, but it can be very disruptive to kind of the current legal world order and the way that the government views its role with respect to financial instruments and financial transactions. And we've seen some of that with kind of the reaction when Libra first announced itself. But with that background, I think it's really helpful to kind of learn from the people who have been at the forefront of doing advocacy on behalf of people who are building things or doing something with the intent of changing policy. And so I'm really happy to have Rainey Reitman here. Rainey, as Kartik said, is the Chief Program Officer at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She's a longtime free speech, digital rights, privacy advocate, not a lawyer, but very embedded in kind of the legal culture, and very knowledgeable about the blockchain and crypto issues, which is the project she also leads at the EFF. But I know, Rainey, we were talking yesterday at the happy hour, and one of the kind of comments was like, you were surprised at how many people didn't know what the EFF was. So I thought like the first question is just, can you give us a summary of what the EFF is and what they do?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jason.
Of course.
So the Electronic Frontier Foundation is a nonprofit that's actually based here in San Francisco, and we focus on the intersection of new technologies and civil liberties. So these are traditional civil liberties issues that we think about around free speech and free expression and our rights to privacy, and how they are threatened and turned on their head by new technologies. And we have a very holistic approach to dealing with these things. So we have an impact litigation team. We actually go out and try to defend and create good case law for users using the court systems. We have an advocacy team that's helping to push policymakers in the right direction. And then we also build technologies. Some of we all free open source tools. We have about a 20-person technology projects team that builds things like HTTPS Everywhere, Privacy Badger, and other tools to help people better protect their privacy and their rights when they go online.
It's awesome. So I have read your personal blog and got a sense, at least from that your interest in this industry and the cryptocurrency and blockchain industry comes out of your experience with kind of facing censorship or working with people who are facing censorship around some of the advocacy work you're doing. So can you give us like, what did spark your interest in this area? What value do you see in kind of the technology and what people are building here?
Sure. So I started being really interested in financial censorship long before I came to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. If we go way back, one of my first jobs out of college was at a very small nonprofit in San Diego called the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, and we had a website that would help folks understand, what's happening with your privacy online and in other instances. And there were 3 of us working there. We literally would pick up the phone and people could call us and be like, I have a privacy problem. Could you help me figure it out? And we would do our very best. And I was getting calls from people who were, they had set up bank accounts with PayPal and were having, transacting on them for weeks, months. And then one day PayPal would write them and say, your account is frozen. And you have to provide additional information, and it would get very uncertain about what they had done, and most of the time they hadn't done anything at all, and had this real air of privacy blackmail to it. It's like PayPal got you hooked, got you set up with the account, maybe you even have funds in there, now it's frozen, and they need more data, more of your personal data to keep using it. So that was my first inkling of this problem. And then I also, I don't think we covered this in the introduction, but I am a co-founder of the Chelsea Manning Support Network. We spent many years advocating and fighting to get Chelsea Manning, the well-known WikiLeaks whistleblower, out of prison. And we also faced financial censorship of our accounts. In 2010, we were running a PayPal account, again PayPal, through our fiscal sponsor. Our fiscal sponsor had had PayPal account for literally years with no problems. We had been running donations for her legal defense for months. She was being held in solitary confinement at the time, and so it was a really important issue, and our account was frozen. And that was my second real experience, and I tried to use networks I had at PayPal to resolve it, and to no avail. They talked about know your customer rights and things like that. And so we sent out a press release, and we're able to get a great amount of press coverage of the issue, and that was the difference. And for me, this was so revelatory. Like this idea that actually PayPal, they didn't have a legal issue at all, because as soon as they got some bad publicity about it, they were willing to reinstate our account. And so those were kind of 2 of the pre-EFF moments that were my first inkling about just how arbitrary payment processors could be, and just how devastating it could be, not just for individuals, but for activist movements, for political groups, for journalistic organizations like WikiLeaks. Pretty much any nonprofit, journalistic organization, researchers, most of them rely on some form of ability to process transactions online, donations, subscriptions, and so getting shut down can have these real devastating effects. And I can give another example, but I feel like I've been talking a while.
No, it's awesome. No, well, it's interesting because one of the things I think we throw out the words in this industry like permissionless and,
Right.
and no KYC or whatever it is, and we think a lot about that in terms of government regulation, where in fact a lot of the kind of censorship of platforms comes from concerns about being associated with a specific group
Right.
or supporting something. And when we, the discussions over, do you have a right to conduct certain financial transactions? I know from reading the same blog piece that you've talked about kind of in your mind the need to have a fundamental shift in the way we think about, giving people access to financial, financial authority and financial ability to send transactions. And your view is, I guess, this technology could play a role in that? I mean, kind of what is your current view of this industry and what it provides to the work that you're doing?
Sure. So one of the things I've been doing over the last, ever since 2010, when I first really experienced financial censorship myself as an activist, and then my move to EFF was to begin to collect these stories around different entities that are being censored online by their payment processors. And it's become very clear to me that right now, the market is failing for financial services. It's failing any website that's, well, not any website, but many websites that are still within the realm of the law but are not necessarily popular can find themselves suddenly cut off. And given that, there's always ways to correct market failures, right? And a lot of people like to point to, well, if the market is failing, it means we need to step in with regulatory interventions. And I'm not necessarily opposed to that. Like if America passed some beautiful law and we all got access to basic financial services and websites could transact, okay, maybe you could find a way to do that. I don't think that's going to happen anytime in the near future. And so what we have to do, given that like absolute political reality, is turn to marketplace alternatives. And when I think about what's out there, there's nothing that is like a traditional financial service that isn't utterly beholden to Visa and MasterCard. And what we have instead is blockchain, right? And that could be such a game changer because there's such innovation and such decentralization around blockchain right now that if financial services coming out of blockchain can manage to support some of these websites, these activist groups, and continue to provide financial services, not only can it be a lifeline for those organizations, but it can also push some of those traditional financial organizations like Visa and MasterCard to start doing right by their users.
Yeah, and so I think we've been kind of talking broadly about financial transactions and financial censorship. And I think it's interesting in this industry because it probably overlaps with areas that you do a lot of work in around free speech and stuff. And at least probably for some of you, I don't know, but I definitely recommend reading it, is in February of last year, after the SEC settled a case with the founder of EtherDelta over the creation of running a decentralized exchange site that the SEC called a securities exchange. Rainey and her team sent a letter to the SEC kind of addressing that order. And can you kind of just tell us, like, what did you say in the letter? What was the purpose of writing it? What were the issues you were most focused on at the EFF?
Absolutely. So the SEC's takedown of EtherDelta and of Zachary Colburn in particular had to do with a lot of different activities that had gone on that were specific to EtherDelta and Zachary Colburn's case, right? And so we didn't weigh in on all of that. But we did review what the SEC put out in relation to that cease and desist order and that settlement agreement. And they put out a statement that accompanied the cease and desist order that said that they would be taking a functional approach to assessing whether or not something was a national securities exchange. And they had this tortured sentence. I'm sure you remembered it. It was like this huge, god-awful sentence. And they said one of the factors they said, for example, was whether or not someone provided an algorithm in order that would connect different parties. And that phrase in particular gave us great pause, this idea of if someone is merely providing an algorithm and that alone, that absolutely cannot be enough to be providing a securities exchange, right? And I don't know if you want me to jump back into case law here. I can do it. Is this the moment? Shall I dive into EFF's history around?
Yeah, I mean, sure, right? Like, I think, give the crowd a little bit of background on like kind of where the EFF's rise to prominence came from and the issues you guys focused on initially that gave you a lot of prominence.
Well, I'll kind of connect it through the EtherDelta case. So one of the things we talked about, and this is kind of core to EFF's history and our work in this space and our impact litigation, is around thinking about computer code as expressive not merely as a way to communicate to a computer what you want it to do, but also as a way to express ideas to other humans who are engaged in coding and have the ability to understand what you're saying. And we actually defended a young security researcher, Dan Bernstein, in the 90s, and helped to bring this up through the court system and establish that computer code has First Amendment protections just like other forms of speech. And this really changed the landscape in the United States around how we think about computer code. And it also had this ripple effect where we've seen other court systems. We've been arguing and doing some education around this down throughout South and Latin America with judges down there as well. And so we talked about this in our EtherDelta letter. So we explained to the SEC, when you talk about providing an algorithm, you have to understand that you're wading into complicated constitutional areas that have really important and really vital free expression protections in them. And it's not the case that you can say that anyone providing an algorithm can be held accountable for violating securities laws. There's a bigger level of assessment that needs to happen. So we kind of explained that to the SEC, and then they also had something in their cease and desist order that was really nerve-wracking to us, which is they said that Zachary Colburn should have known that his product would be used for illegal purposes. And this flies completely in the face of tech policy. This isn't how it works. If you provide a neutral tool and somebody down the road abuses that tool to engage in fraud or some other form of illegal activity, you're absolutely not supposed to be held liable for it. And it was very worrisome to us that the SEC didn't get that. It would be no different from saying, oh, if you've got someone who robs a bank and then runs out and jumps in a getaway car and like heads for the hills, and then you're trying to hold the car manufacturer accountable, right? Like, just because someone later used your services to engage in illegal activity doesn't mean that your neutral product should have been held accountable. So we sent that letter, and we also got on the phone with the SEC and had a robust conversation that I like to think they walked away with a deeper understanding of the constitutional issues.
Well, I know, like, Commissioner Peirce, who's been in the news recently for talking about kind of securities laws related to cryptocurrency, like, even after that was like making comments that would suggest, at least that she heard a lot of what you guys were relaying. I think the interesting thing from my perspective as a lawyer who comes from a financial regulatory background, right, that assumption that the financial intermediaries in the system should know what's going on or do have a role to play in kind of like making sure their platforms are only used in a way that the government is happy with is a fundamentally different concept than like tech policy, which is, to the extent that we're building expressive code that anybody can use for a lot of purposes, so long as it's not, inherently malicious in nature, that liability doesn't flow. I guess from that foundation, like, where do you see this policy discussion going? Do you think there's, it's gonna stay around this issue of kind of First Amendment rights to write the code, or do you, what are the issues that the EFF is looking at going over, the next year or two?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? If only we had a prediction market, we could imagine the future. So I'm worried about a bunch of things in this space. I am worried about regulatory responses to decentralized exchanges in particular, and I'm worried about.
I am too.
I'm worried about regulatory responses to privacy coins, and I think it is well within the scope of possibility that misguided regulators could attempt to put restrictions on the publication of code in their attempts to do something in both of these cases. And it wouldn't be the first time we saw this, right? So if you can remember in the 90s, this was the Clinton administration's whole idea of how to deal with encryption was, well, we'll consider it to be a munition. And if somebody wants to have strong cryptography, they can apply to the government and get a license to export munitions internationally. And that was their whole process, and that was the law in the United States that they put into effect, and that EFF eventually, was able to thankfully get taken down. But at the time, when they said publish encryption or provide encryption, they literally meant even if you didn't take it outside of the United States, even if you just published it in a book in the United States on physical paper and never exported it, that would be enough to trigger. So we have this history of regulators doing idiotic things when it comes to cryptography, and now we're starting to see inklings of that today. So
when the cryptography can move money, it becomes even
right,
more.
And then it triggers all sorts of other things. So the UK government just sent out their call the UK government is updating their standards around how they're going to handle money laundering. And one of the questions they asked for feedback on was whether or not the bans or regulations around publishing open source code should be something they should consider, right? So this is an idea that's been circling around. I don't know exactly like what kind of thing we might have to fight, whether that's going to come as just a regulator starting to crack down suddenly on a particular industry, or if Congress is going to attempt to pass something. I can say, having fought a lot of bills in Congress over the course of my career, that these things move very fast. They move very fast. And what can happen is these conversations that they feel like they're just sort of, oh, they're just around the corners. It's just a couple of weird, occasional folks in DC who are talking about this. It's not serious. They had a hearing or two, but who cares? And maybe folks aren't engaging too much. And then there is the worst news story you could possibly imagine. And all of a sudden, Congress feels like they have to do something about crypto. And that's when you get the worst law you can have, right? And so that's what I'm worried about. And that's when I have a wonderful colleague who said, you never want to be paddling out when the wave hits, right? You want to be already on your surfboard. And so similarly, you don't want to be building your relationships with Congress and educating them on the public benefits of cryptocurrency when that horrible news story hits. You want to have already done that groundwork.
Yeah, and so I think like ending here, I'll kind of make the pitch for you. I know we've talked a decent amount. One of the things that you've told me is like talking to teams early is helpful for you,
Yep.
right? Because you guys want to be involved, from helping the ideation stage to, what people are going to be doing so that you're in a position to help out if it becomes contentious. Is it?
I'd say that's completely true. So I'd say we're starting to build deeper relationships to cryptocurrency and blockchain companies in general. One, because it's useful for us to kind of talk to them. I mean, you'd be surprised how many, especially if they are companies that aren't just building protocols, but are also doing some kind of custodial services. They are doing really basic stuff for user rights that this should be so obvious, like publish a transparency report. That's not that hard, right? It's like set up basic protections so that you don't just hand over 100% of the user data to the government every time they like sneeze in your direction. And that's, I remember talking to a regulator in the cryptocurrency space a couple of years ago. She said, I love these cryptocurrency companies. I love them because they send us more SARs and more data than anybody in the traditional banking industry ever would. It's amazing, and it's so disgusting to me, right? Like, that's disgusting. So I think there's a basic stuff like that. And then there's, and then also, we found out about EtherDelta and the SEC when it was public. And maybe it would have been a different conversation if we'd found out a little bit earlier, before they'd hit that settlement agreement. So I'd say that's really interesting. And I would also say that it's been so helpful for us as we're continuing to think about where should EFF engage, how can we have the biggest impact, to start hearing directly from the folks who are facing government pressure and other kinds of pressure from regulators. So yes, early and often communication.
Awesome. Well, I hope you get to talk to a lot of people. Thank you so much for coming out and being with us. And if you guys aren't members or don't donate to the EFF, I highly recommend it. So thank you.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Rainey, and thanks so much to her for being available and doing that with me. As I said before we started the interview, I am currently brainstorming some ideas for my next video, and I would love to get your input. So just to throw out a couple of the things I'm thinking about, one area I'm interested in discussing is the constitutional law issues that revolve around the kind of cryptocurrency industry, including issues related to the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. Also, if you know me at all, you know I'm very interested in kind of NFTs and some of the interesting projects around artwork and gaming items. And so along that topic, I would love to dig into intellectual property rights and NFTs, and like, what is it that you actually own when you have a token that represents maybe a piece of artwork. But if you have any other ideas, or if you're particularly fond of one of those ideas and want to let me know, definitely reach out. I'm very available on Twitter and on our Discord. Yeah, until next time then, keep it decentralized.